How many Christians who were raised in a Christian home decided to take the faith of our fathers for granted, or perhaps even reject it, or perhaps disrespect the serious faith of a Christian father? Today, we're going to be talking about this idea of having a father who is a believer, and yet the son decides to go a different way. Very modern problem that many fathers who love their children have a prayer and a heart for the faith of my son or my daughter. Today, we're going to be seeing this doesn't always happen. And it didn't happen in the book of Daniel. We're going to be seeing that today when we come right back. Hi, and welcome to Bible Study with Friends, where our goal is to help you get more impact from your Bible study. I'm here with my friend Kyle Grinstead, and Kyle and I are going to be continuing in the book of Daniel. This is part 8 in our series, and we're going to be looking at the story of Belshazzar. First of all, historically, Belshazzar takes over from his father. He was king for about 14 years. So here we have a jump. When chapter 5 begins, it was at the end of his reign. And we're going to see some interesting things about that reign as king in just a moment. But just to give it this historical perspective, Nebuchadnezzar served for 43 years, including the 7 years he was insane, and then he came back and served for a few more years.
Okay.
Belshazzar, his son, serves only for 14 years. And we're going to get a hint of why that happens in this chapter as we go. But the short reign of Belshazzar was from 553 to 539 BC, about 14 years. That's
Okay.
historical fact. Now, this chapter is really a narrative. So we're going to move very quickly through this. And I'm going to stop us every so often just to make an observation. But let's go through this story of what happens with Belshazzar at the end of his reign. So go ahead and start at verse 1, and let's just go march through it, and we'll stop and make observations as we go here.
All right. Belshazzar the king held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them.
Okay, wait a second now. In the last chapter, Nebuchadnezzar made this great statement that the God of Daniel was the most high God and should be revered and respected and honored, right?
Yeah.
Now here we have Belshazzar, his son, not only ignoring, but disrespecting the God that the king, his father, respected immensely and had come to proclaim. Now, we could say, wait a minute, maybe Belshazzar didn't know about Nebuchadnezzar's faith. Remember, in the last chapter 4, it started out with Nebuchadnezzar made this statement of faith, not just privately, but he made it as a proclamation of the king that was distributed throughout the whole kingdom.
So the whole kingdom basically got chapter 4. They've all seen
That's exactly right. And Belshazzar would have been about that time, at the beginning of chapter 4, he would have been in his teens, because we see that Nebuchadnezzar served for probably another 6 years or 7 years as king, and then Belshazzar becomes king. We think that he was a young man, but we see here him taking steps purposely, I believe, to disrespect the God of his fathers.
Yeah.
And saying, I'm not going with what dad said. I'm going to go on my own, and I'm going to not only ignore, I'm going to disrespect that God. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does.
There?
It doesn't give his motive, but it is interesting how intentional like you said, It wasn't just, oh, there happen to be these vessels in the hutch over there. I'm going to grab one. It was like, no, he told them go
Yeah.
specifically get these that from when we raided Jerusalem.
Get them out of the bank and bring them here
Yeah,
because I want to party with them. And took the objects of worship from the Most High God and decided to use them as a party. So I think
yeah,
this was a purposeful attempt to disrespect the God who his father had respected immensely.
yeah,
And this happens a lot, Kyle, in families today where let's say the mom and dad have a significant faith in God and have accepted Christ and are trying to live for him. So often the children have a tendency as they get older, they get more and more to a point where they reject the faith of their father and mother and they go their own way for a time, sometimes permanently, but often just for a time. And then they come back to that faith. But we see this happen today where a child will disrespect and disassociate himself from his own father's faith. So that's what we see here going. Let's
yeah.
go back. Go ahead. You just finished verse 3.
Okay. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone.
Now, here we see this is idol worship. This is the complete opposite of what his father, Nebuchadnezzar, came to believe, that this is the Most High God. You respect him, you honor him. And now what they're doing is using these implements as part of idol worship, where they praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So we see this
Interesting.
idol
Yeah.
worshiping as part of this rejection of a faith, right?
Yeah.
Okay, keep going. Verse 5.
Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the divine.
What we see here is an interesting little aspect. Now, remember the position Daniel had in the kingdom?
Yeah, he was the lead of the magicians.
He was the head of the magicians. And it's interesting that for this party, and these big parties were fairly typical. We see that in the book of Esther, where the king threw this huge party with 1,000 people in it. So that's fairly typical. But here we see something very interesting, that the conjurers, in that last verse you read, the conjurers, the soothsayers, the people under Daniel's control, had not been invited to the party, because it says after this happened, this hand, after that, he called for them to come to the party. So they were not invited. And it was like a lot of young people that are going to go off the rails. They don't want anybody around who might be able to call them on it. They don't want anybody that can say, wait a minute, that's not what your dad would have wanted. they don't want that. But here, this appearance of the hand happens and he wants an explanation. So he calls these guys in. So continue on the rest of verse 7.
Okay. One question. So just to rephrase or maybe try to understand what you're saying. So are you saying that the enchanters, the magicians, they're his father's advisors, and he doesn't want to listen to it?
You remember the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar where he calls all
Yeah.
these guys in, and Daniel saves their lives by interpreting the dream. And so Daniel is made head over the conjurers and soothsayers and astrologers of the kingdom of Babylon, and had been for years and years by this point.
Okay. Yeah.
So I just think it's significant that Belshazzar did not take the chance of having somebody at the party who might call him on using the utensils of the Most High God. He didn't want any soothsayers who might have said, wait a minute, that's not what your dad would have done.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think he
Just
purposely
getting out
had
from
not
under.
invited them. That
Got
makes
it.
sense?
Yep. It sounds like, is it Rehoboam or Jeroboam, whichever one specifically rejects his father's advisors and listens to the other.
And say, I don't want to hear it. He wasn't taking a chance, and he didn't want anybody at the party that might call him on the issue.
Yeah.
So then pick back up at the rest of that verse. The wise men of
Okay.
Babylon had not been invited.
All right. So the king says to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners.
Okay, now stop there. What do you see happening there? Belshazzar is scared. His face is pale. He is afraid of what this vision is, and that nobody could tell him what it meant. Then his wife comes in. And what do you see in that, in her little statement?
I mean,
Anything jump
one
out
thing
at
that
you?
comes to mind is so there's a man who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. There's been this back and forth where Nebuchadnezzar starts off, he says spirit of the holy gods, and then he says, eventually he comes to say,
The Most High
he is
God,
the
yeah.
most high God.
But this is a statement of an unbeliever, the same that Nebuchadnezzar made early on about, oh, you have the spirits of the gods.
Right.
He's
Plural.
not she's not making a statement of faith, but what she is saying is that Daniel has a reputation as someone whom the gods use in this particular situation, as it was. And then she reminds him, and he probably rolled his eyes. And she says, "This is the guy who helped your dad." And he probably went, oh yeah, my dad, right?
Yeah.
So we see this statement that she was the one that brought up the reputation, that everybody knew this reputation. There's a man, and Belshazzar had chosen to ignore the reputation, not call Daniel. And what we see here a lot of times is people that are off the rails don't want to hear from people they know are going to straighten them out.
Yeah.
They'd rather just ignore that. And that's what the case was. But the wife said, hey, don't be afraid. There's a guy who can answer these questions. That he answered the questions for your dad, the king.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's go back. This is the reputation. So pick up and go from there.
Okay. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation.
Okay, keep reading.
Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom.
Now, there's that little statement that I have heard about you. It's not clear whether he had heard about Daniel just from his wife, or if he had heard about Daniel from his father.
Yeah.
And had chosen for the party to ignore that. So he's been reminded at least by his wife about Daniel. And he says, yeah, I've heard about you. And now we're going to go on with the story. I just find that interesting. It's very human.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like at least one point he would have heard of him from his father's decree, right? Because it mentions Daniel.
Absolutely.
But maybe in one ear, out the other. And
exactly. Again, I think a choice not to hear it, a choice to reject the faith of his father. Go on with 17.
Then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed, and whomever he wished, he spared alive, and whomever he wished, he elevated, and whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him.
Okay. Now I circled all the he's and him's there to show that he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar there. This is not who chose who lives and who dies and who he chose all this stuff. Basically, it's saying God had given all this power to your father because of his faith. And now I love it when Daniel says, you can keep your treasure and keep your rewards and keep all that stuff. I'm going to tell you the interpretation based upon the fact that the Most High God is a God that's been involved in the kingdom of Babylon through your father. And now he's going to be involved in your life. And we'll see that as we go here. Let's go back.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because he doesn't start as if it's a blank slate. Here's the interpretation, that kind of context almost. I think, like you said, it brings more awareness to Belshazzar, maybe that he even walked away from that.
A reminder again, yeah. And which could be very well a reason why Daniel wasn't invited to the party. He didn't want that reminder. And now he goes on, start again in verse 21, where he's reminding Belshazzar of his dad's testimony.
Okay. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets it over whomever he wishes.
Now,
Yet you, his son.
The next word is amazing. What's the next word? Yet. You, his son, have not humbled your heart. So here's an indication that Belshazzar had not taken up the faith of his father. And he says, even though your father had this fantastic testimony and God had done all this for your father, yet you, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. And that even though you knew all this is a place where I absolutely am confident that his father's proclamation of faith was known throughout the kingdom, including in his own family, that Belshazzar knew the testimony and had chosen to reject it and neglect it and ignore it. So Daniel says, you knew this, and you still committed the same sin your dad did before he was a believer in the Most High God. You refused to humble yourself. Now we pick back up. Verse 23.
But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines have been drinking wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways you have not glorified.
Now, what do you see in that verse? It's a repetitive verse because we, the reader, know all that, right?
Yeah. Clearly someone informed Daniel what's been happening, right? Because if he wasn't there, someone told him all that.
With no uncertain terms. And the thing that he says that's amazing to me, and it really speaks to anyone who rejects the Christian faith of his fathers and his mother, he says, the God you've decided to ignore and disrespect is the God who holds your life in his hands. You see where it says that? He reminds him, this is the God who has control over your life, my friend. So wise up.
And he contrasts that with, here are these silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, all these idols that can't understand, let alone have any power, but you're actually not glorifying the one who controls your destiny.
Yeah, and has shown that in the past with your dad. Showed the ability to give power and the sovereignty of reigning as the king, but he did it because your dad believed in the Most High God. and revered him, and yet you have decided you have not glorified him. Then pick up at verse 24.
Then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and Persians.
Now we're gonna see something interesting here. In the statement that the hand wrote, he says mene. He repeats it, and we know from the Old Testament and the New Testament that when a word is repeated, it's got an exclamation point. And he says mene means that your kingdom is basically over. And that has an exclamation point to it because it's repeated. And so we see this very scary message to Belshazzar. And what's his reaction? We see in verse 29.
Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62.
Okay, so here we see Belshazzar trying to make amends basically by honoring Daniel. And he issues this proclamation concerning him that now he had authority as the number 3 in the kingdom. So now he's not just head of the Chaldeans, but he's number 3 in the kingdom.
Yeah.
You have the king and the king's closest advisor, and then you have Daniel. But it's too little, too late. And where so many people will honor a pastor or honor a teacher, and they forget to honor the God who empowers.
Yeah.
And Belshazzar tried that. And that
Didn't
night
work.
he died. That's why we know this is at the end. And he not only dies, what does it say?
A Mede took over.
Yeah, but before that, what does it say about his death?
He was slain.
He was slain. He didn't just die. God basically allowed an action that took his kingdom and took his life away from him. So he he didn't die of old age or didn't die of fright. He died because somebody was allowed by God to take steps to end his life. And Darius the Mede, the Persian, takes over. And we begin to see now, in the next chapter, a verse about Darius. And we'll do that as the story continues. So this narrative has been pretty much with the idea of you kids should pay attention to the faith of your father. And don't reject it. Don't ignore it. Don't take it for granted, right? Listen and respond because God has your life in his hands, and take action against your arrogance and against your faith. Do you have any other observations about the chapter?
Yeah, it relates to what you said there at the end by him getting slain. It relates to that. But this is the third story in Daniel where there's been a dream and then Daniel interprets it. And we talked before about how visions, God can use visions. But I think it's interesting that in each of these cases, God could have made it clear in the vision right up front and spoken very directly to Nebuchadnezzar, to Belshazzar. But instead, he gives it a kind of confusing or vague vision, but then he uses Daniel as the means to interpret it. And I just find that kind of interesting.
And it's really a picture of the New Testament. A non-believing person doesn't have the capacity to really understand the scriptures because he doesn't have the Holy Spirit. So when God speaks to him through the scriptures, he goes, I don't have a clue what this means. It takes a believer to come alongside of him and say, this is what it says, my friend, and this is how you can accept that. And if you do, good things happen where you are entered into the faith like Nebuchadnezzar was. So I really see here a picture, Kyle, of that's really the ministry of who God brings into people's lives to intercede with them about what God says about their lives.
Yeah, that's
I've had
a cool
guys
parallel.
say, I've read the Bible, I just don't understand it. And we talk and they become a Christian, they accept Christ, and they start to read the same things they read before and they go, wow, I had no idea it said that. Why? Because the Holy Spirit comes in as an interpreter that the non-believer didn't have.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it's a
See
beautiful
the
thing.
parallels there?
Uh-huh.
So Daniel is really a picture of God using believers in the lives of non-believers to great effect. He used Daniel in the life of the king, Nebuchadnezzar, who becomes a
Yeah.
strong believer. And he uses him in the life of his son, who is not a believer and refuses to give God glory and therefore loses his kingdom as a direct response to prophecy. And
Yeah.
the Medes, the Persians, were a direct response to the prophecy. And Darius comes in as the king to fulfill the prophecy of God. And it's very interesting. I think Darius hears about this as he starts to rule. And we'll see that starting next chapter. It's very interesting. Today, we've been talking about a child who rejects or disrespects the faith of his father and how this happened to Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. I want to recommend a video to you. It's called Being in Christ's Family. It's out of the book of Mark, and I think you'll enjoy it. And in the meantime, we're going to continue our study in Daniel next week. And until then, God bless you.